Hello everyone. In this training session, we will walk through the component definition window. Let's begin by understanding the process flow. You initiate the process by accessing the component definition screen, where a new record can be created. It is essential to complete all required fields, and once the information is entered, the record must be saved. This marks the completion of the setup. First, ensure that the organization setup, input values, balance, event group, and retro component charges have already been completed before proceeding. To continue, navigate to the HR Management folder, open the General Setup, and then click on Component Definition to proceed. Select the appropriate organization, then enter the component name, classification, and reporting name. Next, enter the start date, processing priority, and processing type, and mark the checkbox True if required. Finally, click Save to complete the record. Now, let's switch to the system and walk through each step to understand the configuration in action. This is the login screen. You will enter your username and password, and then click on the Login button. Upon successful login, the home screen will appear with some useful default widgets and charts. To access the screen, navigate to HR Management, and then Component Definition. This screen defines payroll and leave-related components like basic salary, allowances, deductions, or leave types, based on organizational requirements. Click on New Record to start creating a component. Now, let's go through each field one by one. For organization, select the organization for which you want to define this component. For component name, enter a clear and unique name for the component, such as basic salary or sick leave. For component classification, choose whether this is an earning deduction, employer contribution, or leave component. For reporting name, enter the name you want to appear in reports. For start date, specify the date from which this component will be active. For end date, you can optionally define an end date if the component is valid only for a specific period. Processing priority determines the order in which components are processed during payroll calculation. Components with lower priority numbers are processed first, while those with higher numbers are processed later. This is important when some components depend on others. For example, a deduction is calculated based on a prior earning. For leave-related components, you may want paid leave components to be processed before leave deductions, ensuring proper value adjustment. This ensures each component is processed in the right logical flow during a payroll run. The processing type field defines how often the component will be processed in the payroll cycle. Select recurring if the component is paid or deducted on a regular basis, such as monthly salary, HRA, or standard deductions. For example, basic salary or PF contribution are applied in every payroll run. Use non-recurring for components that are paid occasionally, or one time only, such as a bonus, incentives, or reimbursement. These components are not automatically calculated every month and need to be entered when applicable. To start, reporting convention is where you define how this component will be reported, typically for compliance or financial reporting purposes. For currency, select the currency applicable to this component, which is usually based on the organization's default. Next, we have a few important checkboxes. Multiple entry allowed is enabled if the component can be entered multiple times within a single payroll period. When DB items generated upon saving is checked, the relevant database entries will be auto-generated after saving. Is information component is used for components that are informational only and not used in calculations. Finally, if exclude in retro calculation is selected, the component will be excluded from any retroactive payroll processing. For description, you can provide any additional notes or context for this component. Now, moving to the additional information section, this section includes more specific options. Select hours, days, component, if the component is based on working hours or the number of days. Enable overtime component if the component represents any kind of overtime. If checked, restrict entry in expense means this component cannot be entered under employee expenses. If carried over is marked true, the component is carried forward to the next period. When carried over is selected, an additional field becomes visible. Leave type. Select the leave type to which this component is associated, like casual leave or sick leave. Now, let's begin with creating a payroll component. Click on New Record. First, select the organization as star. If the component is applicable to multiple organizations, you can repeat the same steps for each. In the component name, enter basic salary. Set the reporting name as the same, basic salary. For classification, choose earning since this is a type of income received by an employee. Enter the start date as January 1st, 2000. Make sure that the start date is earlier than the employee's joining date to avoid validation errors during a payroll run. Set the processing priority as 500. A lower value means higher priority, so this component will be processed first during payroll execution. Select the processing type as recurring because basic salary is paid every month. Under Reporting Convention, choose Basic Salary from the drop-down. Currency will be selected by default as INR. Now, move on to the checkboxes. Leave Multiple Entry Allowed unchecked since basic salary is paid once per month. Keep Is Information component unchecked because this component is used in payroll calculation. Also, keep Exclude in retro calculation unchecked so that if there are any backdated changes in salary, this component is included in retro processing. Other checkboxes such as Hours Days component, Overtime component, or Carried Over are not applicable for basic salary, so leave them as they are. Once all the fields are filled, click on Save. After saving, you'll notice that DB item generated upon saving is automatically marked as true, and the basic salary component is now successfully created. Now, move on to the Input Value tab to complete the remaining configuration for the basic salary component. Once you switch to this tab, you'll notice that organization and component type fields are auto-filled from the Header tab, so there is no need to update them manually. In this section, we define the input value, which is directly linked to the component for payroll calculation. As explained in the previous training video, only those input values that are already configured in the system will appear in the drop-down list, so if the input value is not created beforehand, it won't be visible here. For the basic salary component, select Amount as the input value. Selecting amount here indicates that a calculation is associated with this component, such as the actual salary value to be paid. Once the input value is selected, the data type should be selected as amount since we're dealing with numeric salary figures. This is selected from a predefined list in the system. By default, the Generate DB item checkbox is marked as true. And upon saving the record, the system automatically generates the database item, and the DB item generated checkbox will reflect as true. Now, let's create another input value for this component. Click on New Record again within the Input Value tab. In the Input Value field, enter Pay Value. Select the data type as amount, since this value will also hold numeric salary information. This input value is commonly used for referencing within formulas or in other components. If no formula is written for pay value, we can directly tag the basic salary amount into it. In such cases, during a payroll run, the system will treat pay value as equal to the amount defined for the basic salary component. Once all fields are entered, click on Save. Now both input values, amount and pay value, are successfully configured for the basic salary component. Go back to the Home button and then click on that. Next, let's move to the Balance Feed tab. In this tab, we tag the created component to a balance. A single component can contribute to multiple balances, depending on organizational needs or legislative requirements. These balances can later be used in payroll reports, tax calculations, or YTD summaries. When payroll is processed, the calculated amount from the component is added to the tagged balance. This happens every month, and the accumulation logic depends on how the balance is defined: monthly, yearly, or from inception. Organization and component type fields are auto-filled from the header tab, so no manual input is needed here. Next, we have the input value field. The system will filter and display only those input values that were created earlier in the Input Value tab for this component. In our case, it could be amount or pay value. After that, we have the Balance field. The drop-down will show only those balances that are already created in the system. As explained in the previous training on balance definition, if no balance has been created, nothing will appear in this field. You must define balances in advance to use them here. Next, select the data type. This is a predefined list. Since we're working with salary values, we'll choose amount, as the return value from this component returns an amount used in payroll calculation. Then, we have the Add Subtract option. Select Add if the component value should be added to the selected balance. Choose Subtract if the component value needs to be deducted from the balance, for example, in the case of deductions, or leave without pay. Once all required fields are entered, click Save to complete the configuration. This completes the balance feed setup for the basic salary component. The system will now update the selected balance every time payroll is processed, based on the values calculated through this component. Go back to the Home button and then click on that. Now let's move to the Retro Calculation section and configure the event group for this component. Before configuring this tab, it's important to note that the event group must be defined in advance. As explained earlier in the detailed event group configuration training video, the event group needs to be set up before you can select it here. In this tab, you will find three fields. Organization and component type are auto-filled from the header tab. The event group drop-down will display only those values that have already been defined in the system. If no event group has been configured, nothing will appear in the drop-down, and you will need to go back and create it first. We bind an event group only to those components for which retrospective changes are expected. For example, if basic salary changes are likely in the future, we tag an event group to that component to ensure retro calculation is triggered correctly. Since the event group is already configured in our case, we will now select the appropriate event group from the drop-down list. After that, click on Save to complete the configuration. Next, go back to the Home button, and then click on that. Now let's move to the Retro Component tab. This tab defines which component will receive the retro or arrear value during retroactive payroll processing. When a retro event is triggered, such as a backdated salary change, the arrear amount needs to be processed under a specific component, and this is exactly what we configure here. Before configuring this tab, make sure that an arrear component already exists in the system, because the retro value needs a destination component to post to. For example, an arrear basic salary component should be created first. This configuration should only be done for those components where an event group is already linked, and we expect retrospective changes, such as changes in salary or allowances. Click on New Record. The organization and component type are auto-filled from the Header tab. Select the Retro component, which is the component where the arrear amount will be posted, for example, arrear basic salary. Once a component is selected, the input value drop-down will be filtered automatically, and will show only those input values that were defined under that component, like pay value or amount. Once all fields are selected, click on Save to complete the configuration. This ensures that whenever a retro calculation runs, the arrear is properly transferred to the defined retro component. Next, go back to the Home button, and then click on that. Let's move to the Component Charge tab. This tab is primarily used for finance integration. It defines which payroll component value will flow into which financial charge after the payroll is processed. Before configuring this section, the relevant charges must already be defined in the system. If you're unsure how to create charges, refer to the separate training video titled Charge Configuration, where this process is explained in detail. Only those charges that have the payroll charge checkbox enabled during setup will be available in this drop-down, and the system will filter and display only valid payroll charges here. Organization and component type are auto-filled from the Header tab. For example, if each organization has a different account or charge mapping, you'll need to create and bind the charge individually, organization-wise. In our current case, we are working with the STAR organization, and we've already created a charge specifically for basic salary. So now, we'll select the appropriate charge from the drop-down, for example, basic salary charge. This ensures that once the payroll run is complete, the consolidated value of basic salary will flow into the selected charge for financial posting. After filling in all required details, click on Save to complete the setup. This is how you can create as many payroll components as needed, based on earning, deduction, and contribution types. The process is the same. Only the processing type, classification, and priority will differ. Start with earnings, then deductions, and lastly contributions. Priority should be defined in the same order to ensure correct processing. If the component is for retro calculation, tag the event group and retro component. If not, make sure to add an input value, define the balance feed if needed, and set the component charge for correct posting to finance. This concludes this session. Thank you for attending.